I've worked in the African bush for most of my life, nearly 3 decades now, and I thought I had seen it all. Lions giving birth right on the trail, elephants mourning over their dead, even a giraffe saving a calf from a leopard once. But nothing, and I mean nothing, surprised me more than the friendship that bloomed between our sanctuary's guard dog, Thandi, and a wild hyena we came to call Kazi. The Mavumo Wildlife Sanctuary, where I work, lies on the border of a national park in northern South Africa. It's a transitional area, surrounded by a high game fence, not quite wilderness but far from civilization. Our job here is part protection, part rehabilitation. We take in injured wildlife, orphaned cubs, and animals displaced by human-wildlife conflict. And because of the sanctuary's remoteness, we've always needed solid protection, both from poachers and from wild predators curious about the smells of recovery animals on the inside. Thandi, our Boer Bull Mastiff, had been with us for 5 years by the time this story began. Boer Bulls are bred for protection, massive, muscular, alert, but Thandi was special. She wasn't just a brawler. She was intuitive, calm, and had an almost eerie understanding of what was dangerous and what wasn't. She patrolled the perimeter like it was her kingdom, making regular loops from dusk to dawn, with the low growl of distant lions and the occasional rustle of warthogs in the brush as her night music. One cool winter night in late June, I noticed her behavior shift slightly. She would stop at the same section of fence near the eastern boundary, just by a small, dry riverbed, and stand still, ears up, tail wagging, not barking. That's not like Thandi. If she sensed a predator, she'd usually bark, loud, sharp, a warning. But this? It was almost like she was curious, or expectant. I assumed it was a stray jackal or perhaps a bush pig, something she didn't view as a threat. But this kept happening, every night for nearly a week. She'd finish her rounds, then return to that same stretch of fence, sometimes even sitting down, waiting, tail flicking like a metronome. One night, just past midnight, I took my torch and quietly approached from the opposite side, staying downwind. And that's when I saw it for the first time, eyes glowing in the beam, low to the ground, but not creeping like a predator. It was a hyena, a young male, probably around 2 years old, from what I could tell. Now, understand this. Wild hyenas are not friends of humans or dogs. They're powerful, unpredictable scavengers, intelligent, yes, but wary and opportunistic. In this part of the country, they are also known to steal kills from lions and even snatch unattended livestock from villages. There have been instances of hyenas testing the fences, sometimes trying to dig underneath. And yet, this one, he wasn't behaving like a fence tester. He was playing. He'd dart forward, then back, bow his front legs down in that classic canine posture, then zip left to right like he was trying to initiate a chase. And Thandi? She mirrored him. They were playing through the fence. I stood there for over 20 minutes that first night, watching what I couldn't quite believe. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't territorial behavior. It was pure, instinctual play, the kind you see between puppies or between siblings from the same litter. When the hyena finally loped off into the bush, Thandi sat for a while longer, then returned to her rounds as if nothing had happened. I didn't report it right away. You learn out here not to make too much of a single sighting. Animals surprise you all the time. But when it happened again the next night, and again the night after that, I started taking notes. I logged the exact time, temperature, and moon phase. The hyena, who we would later name Kazi, returned almost every night around the same time, and the interactions grew more elaborate. Sometimes he'd bring objects, a bone, a piece of hide, once even a whole tortoise shell, and drop them near the fence like offerings. Thandi would sniff them through the mesh, occasionally bark once, and then the two would chase each other back and forth along the inside and outside of the barrier, tails up, tongues lolling. After 2 weeks, I told Elias, our head ranger. At first, he laughed, thinking I was pulling a bush joke on him. But when he saw it himself one night, his face changed. Not fear, just a kind of silent astonishment. We started showing the footage from our security cams to the other staff. Everyone agreed, this wasn't normal. It was unheard of. We began referring to the hyena as the visitor. Then, as the sightings became more regular, we named him. Kazi, in Izulu, means curious one, which seemed fitting. His behavior was never threatening. He never tried to dig under, never snarled, never showed his teeth. If anything, he behaved like a stray dog longing for a companion. And Thandi responded in kind. One night during a particularly cold spell, we found her curled up against the fence, sleeping just inches from where Kazi was lying on the other side. Two species, both predators, both territorial by nature, choosing proximity and comfort. It started to shift our thinking. See, people often think of hyenas as brutes. They're the villains in cartoons, the ugly scavengers, the ones who laugh at death. But if you watch them long enough in the wild, you realize that hyenas are incredibly social. They have clans, hierarchies, affection. Mothers are protective and nurturing. Young ones play endlessly. What Kazi was showing us was not an anomaly. It was a form of his nature we just hadn't expected to see expressed toward a dog. One evening in late July, a group of visiting researchers from Pretoria heard about the interactions and asked to set up proper observation equipment. Motion sensors, trail cams, and one low-light drone to fly quietly above. We agreed, so long as they didn't interfere. Over the next month, the footage they collected astonished even the most seasoned field biologists. Kazi's nightly visits were consistent, purposeful, and always centered around Thandi. He never approached other sections of the fence, and he never came on nights when Thandi was off her shift. Once, when Thandi was being treated for a thorn lodged in her paw and kept inside the kennel for a week, Kazi came and sat by the fence anyway. He didn't play. He didn't leave gifts. He just waited, night after night. On the fifth night, I brought Thandi outside on a leash, just to walk near the area, and Kazi immediately perked up, ran along the fence, and started his darting game. Thandi limped, still healing, but barked with excitement. Something had formed between them, and even if we couldn't explain it scientifically, it was undeniable. The researchers published an initial paper about the behavior, cross-species social play between a domestic canine and wild spotted hyena, Crocuta crocuta, but the story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The friendship was growing, evolving. Kazi was maturing. Thandi was becoming more expressive, sometimes even waiting at the fence before sunset, anticipating his arrival. And us? We were caught between awe and uncertainty. What does it mean when wildness chooses connection over fear? By the time we moved into the second month of Kazi's visits, the atmosphere around the sanctuary had changed. At first, Thandi's strange friendship had been a curiosity. Now it was something we planned around. It wasn't just a spectacle, it was part of our rhythm. We'd shifted one of the patrol shifts to make sure someone was always near the eastern fence during Thandi's rounds. Not because we feared Kazi, but because we didn't want anyone else misunderstanding what they saw. Poachers sometimes monitored our boundaries. Local herders occasionally passed through nearby. If anyone saw a hyena lingering near the fence, they might assume the worst. Thandi's schedule was adjusted so that her shift always aligned with Kazi's visits, usually between 9:30 p.m. and midnight. On the rare nights she wasn't there, Kazi didn't show. We tested this once, out of cautious curiosity, sending another of our trained dogs to patrol in her place. A good dog too, reliable, calm, but when Kazi approached and saw it wasn't Thandi, he froze, sniffed the air, and disappeared into the bush within seconds. By August, our head ranger Elias suggested something I never thought I'd hear in a sanctuary meeting. "I want to see what happens if we reduce the barrier," he said. The room went quiet. Not everyone agreed. He clarified, "I'm not saying we let the hyena in. I'm saying maybe we set up a second containment area. Smaller, secure. See if Kazi wants to come closer under controlled circumstances." It was controversial. No one in their right mind invites a wild hyena, especially a subadult male, onto sanctuary grounds. But the researchers argued that this wasn't a normal situation. Dr. Anil Dulamini, the behavioral ecologist overseeing the documentation, had already identified over 24 distinct behaviors in Kazi that mimicked dogplay, not just posture, but vocalization, movement pacing, and object sharing. Eventually, the decision was made. A small 20 by 20 meter enclosure was constructed just outside the main fence, with a gated corridor leading from the fence area Kazi frequented. It wasn't meant to trap him, there were no active restraints or lures. If he didn't want to enter, he wouldn't. We just opened the possibility. And on the third night, he did. It was just after 10 p.m. I was watching from a distance, seated in a camouflaged observation hut about 30 meters away. Thandi was inside her part of the fence, pacing near the usual meeting spot. Kazi appeared as he always did, silent, sudden, as if materializing from the night itself. But this time, the corridor gate was open. He sniffed at it, circled. He looked back toward Thandi, who had started her tail-wagging play bounce, then turned and entered. No coercion, no hesitation. I couldn't believe it. He walked the entire enclosure perimeter first, head low, testing the edges. He made a full loop before stopping directly in front of the internal fence where Thandi was waiting. She barked once, short, sharp, and then they started the dance again. Running side by side, dashing to either end of the shared fence, mirroring each other's turns. But something was different this time. Kazi seemed bolder. He vocalized, short, giggling whoops, and when Thandi dropped to the ground in a roll, he mimicked her. Rolling in the dry dust, back and forth like two pups in a litter. That night changed everything. After that, Kazi returned almost every evening, entering the smaller enclosure freely, waiting near the internal fence for Thandi to begin their routine. At times they simply lay there, watching each other. It was easy to forget one of them was considered a wild predator. Let me make something clear here. None of us romanticized what was happening. We didn't start thinking hyenas were safe. Kazi was still a hyena, an opportunistic carnivore with one of the strongest bite forces in the animal kingdom. There was no touching, no direct interaction. The fence, though thinner now, remained between them at all times. But the behaviors we were documenting, they blurred lines. And then came the night that challenged us all. It was mid-September, during the first real spring rain. Just after 11 p.m., Kazi arrived as usual. But as the rain came down harder, visibility dropped. The patrol team radioed in that Thandi had moved into her dry shelter near the fence line, but Kazi hadn't left. I walked down from the northern lookout to check personally. And I found him curled near the outer wall of the fence, soaked, refusing to move, even though hyenas are known to despise heavy rain. He kept his body angled toward Thandi's shelter, head flat to the ground. I went back inside, grabbed a heavy-duty tarp, and after coordinating with the team, I slowly draped it over the edge of Kazi's enclosure, creating a small dry area where he could take shelter. And he did. It was the first time I saw a wild hyena choose human-made comfort. Not because he was trapped. Not because he was forced. Because he trusted it enough to stay. In the following days, a strange routine formed. Kazi began to arrive before Thandi's shift. He'd wait in the enclosure, pacing, restless, until she was let out. And when she came, it was like a spark. They ran, played, barked, whooped. At times, we caught them both holding sticks on either side of the fence, Kazi gnawing, Thandi pulling, a game of invisible tug-of-war. And still, we debated. Was this real social bonding? Was it imprinting? Was Kazi simply lonely, having lost his clan, perhaps, and seeking company in any form? Or was there something deeper, a kind of interspecies empathy? I don't pretend to have the scientific answers, but I can tell you what I saw. I saw a dog and a hyena waiting for each other like old friends. I saw restraint in a predator that could have easily tested the boundary, yet never did. I saw a guard dog that had chased off leopards and snakes lie down in the dust just to be closer to a creature most would run from. And then came the final test, the one that pushed the story to its edge. One night in early October, Thandi slipped her harness. It was an error, an old clasp on the gate that hadn't been replaced. I was on duty, and my heart stopped when I realized she had walked freely toward the secondary gate that connected to Kazi's enclosure. She didn't go through, but she was close, so close. I called her back, quietly, firmly. And she turned, just like that. Kazi stood watching, silent. He didn't approach, didn't lunge, didn't call. Just stood still, his ears up, his body low, as she trotted back to me and sat at my side. That was the last night we left the gates unlocked. It had gone as well as it could have, but it reminded us of the line we could not cross. Not for safety, not for science, not for sentiment. The fence would stay. But Kazi did too. Months passed. Summer came. The rains returned in full, and still the nightly visits continued. We'd built Kazi a more formal shelter in the enclosure, reinforced with logs and grass matting. He used it regularly. Some nights he stayed long after Thandi left, lying near the spot where they used to meet, before eventually disappearing into the bush again. He was free, always free, and yet he chose to return. Every night, to play, to wait, to be near a friend who, by every law of nature, should have been his enemy. By the start of the new year, we could no longer pretend that the bond between Thandi and Kazi was a passing phase. It had endured the seasons, the rains, and every attempt at scientific explanation. It had become something that now defined both animals. But it also brought us to a crossroad. Kazi was maturing. His shoulders were broader, his head heavier. You could see it in the way he moved now, less darting, more deliberate. And more than that, there were signs that his presence was beginning to stir unrest in the wild hyena clans nearby. Tracks appeared regularly around the outer perimeter, sometimes more than one set. A few mornings, we found scent markings close to the fence, a warning from other males. He was being watched. One night in January, the pattern changed. Kazi arrived unusually late. Thandi had already completed her patrol and was lying down near the gate, eyes half closed. When Kazi finally emerged from the dark, he looked different, wary, unsettled. He paced the edges of his enclosure erratically and didn't engage in play. That night, he didn't stay long. He left within 15 minutes. The next night, he didn't come at all. Then, for 4 nights in a row, nothing. It felt like an ache none of us could quite describe. Thandi kept returning to the fence anyway, lying in wait. She seemed more restless on her patrols, distracted. We left the enclosure gate open every night, just in case. And then, on the 5th night, just past midnight, Kazi returned. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, standing in the bushline beyond the cleared perimeter, were 2 other hyenas, larger, older, less comfortable with humans. They didn't approach, but they didn't leave either. They watched. Kazi walked to the enclosure like before, but he didn't enter. He stood just outside the gate, staring toward the shelter where Thandi now sat up, ears forward. He let out a soft whooping call, a sound we hadn't heard from him in months. A long, rising whoop, like a beacon call. Thandi barked. Once, low and firm. But Kazi didn't play. He turned and walked back toward the bush, pausing once at the edge of the tree line. The others waited, and then they disappeared into the dark together. That was the last time we saw him for nearly 3 weeks. The researchers were cautious in their theories. Was this natural re-assimilation into a clan? Possibly. Was it a sign that Kazi had reached a point in development where his biological instincts overrode his unique social bond? Likely. But emotionally, for those of us who had watched this unfold night after night, it felt like a goodbye. We tried not to anthropomorphize. But it was hard, especially when Thandi continued to wait. She waited every night, sometimes only for minutes, sometimes for hours. Her body language changed, more pacing, more alertness toward sounds in the bush. Once or twice she let out short, confused barks toward the fence. It was clear she was expecting something, someone. But Kazi didn't return, not then. It was early March, at the tail end of the rainy season, when everything changed again. One morning, one of the rangers doing early perimeter checks radioed in. Tracks. Near the south fence. Big ones. Hyena. Maybe more than one. When we checked, it was clear, 2 sets of hyena tracks, plus blood traces. Not much, just a few drops. Something had happened nearby. Later that night, just after midnight, we got a motion alert from the enclosure. Kazi had returned. He was limping. We don't know what happened exactly. Perhaps a territorial dispute, maybe a failed hunt, but he had a gash across his front leg, and though he was walking, he was slower, more cautious. He entered the enclosure again, for the first time in nearly a month, and lay down near the fence without playing. Thandi arrived 10 minutes later, and when she saw him, she gave the softest series of whines I've ever heard from her, almost like a whimper. They didn't move much that night. Just sat near each other, still and quiet. When Kazi left an hour later, he moved even slower, favoring the injured leg. We followed his trail to the edge of the bush the next morning and found a resting place he had dug into the sand. He was bedding down nearby. Staying close again. The old rhythm resumed, but it was gentler now. No more wild games of chase. Instead, they spent the nights lying close, sometimes mirroring each other's posture, both alert, both still. The researchers began noting signs of social comfort rather than play. And we began asking harder questions. What would happen if Kazi's injury worsened? Should we intervene? Could we treat a wild hyena that had never been inside a human structure, without breaking the trust he had built? What would happen to Thandi when, eventually, Kazi left for good? And then, the biggest question of all, should we prepare to say goodbye? We debated. Long meetings, ethics boards, wildlife department input. There was no precedent for what we had witnessed. And we couldn't trap Kazi, not ethically, not legally. He wasn't an exhibit. He wasn't our animal. In the end, we did what I believe was the right thing. We let it be. We continued providing access to the enclosure, keeping the gate open, leaving water and basic shelter. We observed, recorded, and respected the boundary. We didn't touch. We didn't tame. And Kazi? He came and went. Sometimes gone for a week. Sometimes back for 3 nights straight. His limp slowly healed. His body grew stronger again. One night, we saw a third hyena watching from the brush line, female, maybe a year old. Kazi looked back toward the enclosure once, then followed her into the trees. The last confirmed visit was late May. He came alone, stayed 2 hours, lay by the fence. Thandi barked once. No games, just quiet. And then he left. That was a year ago now. He hasn't returned since. Thandi still patrols. She's older now, slower, but still sharp. She doesn't wait by the fence anymore. But sometimes, during quiet nights, she lies down near the same old spot, facing the bush. I don't know if she remembers. But I do. We all do. It wasn't fiction. It wasn't a trick of the camera or a fluke of behavior. It was real, a wild hyena and a domestic dog finding something in each other that defied every instinct. Not ownership. Not dependence, just presence, and, perhaps, something like friendship. The researchers published 2 major papers. One is still being cited in behavioral ecology studies today. We've had universities send students to study the site. None of them quite believe the story until they read the logs, see the footage, and hear it from us directly. But for me, I don't need the science. I saw it. I lived it. And every time the sun sets over the dry grass of Mavumo, I think of a night when laughter and barking echoed in harmony through the fence line, and 2 animals taught us that nature isn't always predictable, but it is always watching, always listening, and sometimes, just sometimes, choosing connection over fear.